Come to the conversation on Muslim women mathematician. So this is Professor Marianne Ruth Kamp. Did I get your name right, Professor?
Yes, that's correct.
So Dr. Marianne Ruth Kamp, she is a professor at Indiana University, and she is expert on Uzbek women. Uzbek is an important country because the algebra was born, because the father of algebra was born there. Al-Khwarizmi really came to Baghdad from Uzbek, if I'm right.
So Al-Khwarizmi, of course, came from Khwarezm. This is long before there was an Uzbekistan and
Right.
before the um, Uzbek Turkic tribes even came to that part of the world. But it was a very mixed place. And of course, this is all part of Uzbekistan's intellectual history. When we look at the sciences, there's a tremendous number of people who, for a great many years, have been considered Arabs who were not Arabs, but who contributed to the intellectual projects of the Arabic Islamic world and who came from places that are now located in Uzbekistan.
That is correct. They contributed in the Islamic Golden Age. So
Yes.
yeah, we're gonna be talking about Islamic Golden Age in a few seconds. But my first questions to you, because nobody can help us understand this better than you, because you are an expert on gender bias, especially gender bias. So that is, there is an stereotype against women, against all type of women, not only Muslim women. There is a stereotype against women that they are bad at math. What is your take on that?
So I think that we encourage certain sets of skills and discourage certain sets of skills for lots and lots of different reasons. But in many cases, in many countries, um, throughout time, there hasn't been a lot of encouragement of young girls to pursue interests in math. And that can create then um, self selecting uh, ideas among young girls that even if I'm good at this, it's not for me, or perhaps a lot of self doubt. The idea that this I struggle with this, and so that means I'm not good at it. So I think that those are kind of psychology of education questions that are why could be investigated in most countries in the world, and perhaps one of the ways to test any of them would be to look at the places where girls are thought of as being more competent at math, um, and figure out, so what's the difference. So I think those are uh, just widespread sorts of views across the world, right?
So motivation is important, and motivation usually starts from home. Our conversation really gonna focus on Islam and the Muslim women, and especially Muslim women mathematician. So Islam was founded. The Prophet Muhammad was born 570, and then he founded Islam 610, and by the time he died 632, I think the entire Middle East, the main religion in entire Middle East was Islam by the time.
No, only in the Arabian Peninsula.
On
The spread of Islam really takes place during um, the caliphate of Umar and of Uthman as the dominant religion, as in the religion of everyone in the area, until around the 800s.
Speaking of 800, really the golden age really starts like around 800, right? And it lasts like 300-400 years until 1120-25. So what causes the starting of Islamic Golden Age? We witness at least four Muslim women mathematicians during this Golden Age. Fatima Al-Firi, who built a world fast university, and then Mariam Al-Astrolabe, who is also known as, I believe, Al-Isli. She invented astrolabe, which is modern day, you can call it protractor or GPS or even maybe telescope. And then Muhammad Ali, she translated and she understood and she solved some of the problem from Al-Khwarizmi's algebra book. She was the first woman who attempted to do that.
Wow. That's
and
amazing. I didn't know anything about that. That's great.
and Lubna of Cordova. So these four women really kind of came from Islamic world. One from Morocco, who was Fatima al-Firi. The other one was from Syria, which still is very close to Baghdad. Baghdad was the center of everything at that time during the Islamic Golden Age, and then Muhammad Ali. She was born in actually Baghdad. She was born, raised, and did her contribution in math in Baghdad. And then Lubna was on the other side of the world in Spain, Al Andalus. But they all contributed in math different ways. So,
So you're including astronomy within the world of math, essentially.
yes, because
Because there's no point in dividing these sciences.
right, right, and I would like to consider math as science.
That gets to the bigger question of what kind of assumptions can we make about the Golden Age? Do we view these women as exceptions? Do we view them as the norm?
Even exceptional people need some, as you said, inspiration, because exceptional people did not born as an exceptional people. A 3-year-old, 4-year-old, 5-year-old, probably
Right.
someone had to encourage
and then
them.
going back to your other question about the formation of people, does the inspiration come from their society, or does it come from their family, or both? That is the girl who grows up to invent an astrolabe, does she come from a family of ilmi people who have, spent their lives in madrasas studying stars and things like that, or does she come from a tribal leader's family? Is she from the ordinary people? Is she from an intellectual family? That would be very different in thinking about whether society as a whole encourages the education and intellectual achievements of girls, or whether that is an exceptional thing. It was kind of one of Layla Ahmed's early questions when she looks at the records of women of the Golden Age and of early Islam and so forth, the ones whose names we know who become shapers of traditions, and she regards them as exceptions rather than as supported by a social structure that says, oh, girls can do anything. She says, in her reading of those early sources, she says, look at the words of their own fathers who say, I had to struggle to get my daughter to do this because it wasn't accepted.
I just want to understand what causes it's not only women, what causes the Islamic Golden Age. Is there any particular thing that caused the Islamic Golden Age, and what causes the decline? We saw the decline around 11th century. So what causes the rise of Islamic Golden Age, and what causes the decline, and why it lasted only 300 years, not 400, not 500?
You're from South Asia, aren't you?
Yes.
A place where the Golden Age of science is a much different time period. We couldn't talk about a particular Golden Age of science, and there's a Golden Age of science a couple thousand years ago, and then there's a totally different Renaissance under the Mughals and whatever.
Mughal lasted for 400 years, from 15 to...
Yeah. So in the area that we think of today as Uzbekistan, people would say, what are you talking about Golden Age of science? Of course, the Golden Age of science here was around the time of Ulugh Beg.
Yes.
So that's, the 1500s.
Right.
And so, but that actually is kind of helpful with thinking about what are the structures, the social structures, the governmental support, the institutional kinds of things that make it possible for science to flourish as opposed to science being crushed, right? And in Uzbekistan, there are these standard stories, and I say that very specifically. I tell you this, standard stories, precisely because I'm not a 14th century historian. I don't read the sources. I don't even ask these questions. I only hear about them when I go to Uzbekistan and people say, blah, 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 Ulugh Beg this, Ulugh Beg that. Their story their very standard version of this story is that, um, of course, when Timur carried out his world conquest, he was very interested in uh, bringing all of the world's resources to Samarkand, and that included attracting scholars and artists and all of the usual things that happen when you have some big flourishing governmental entity that isn't afraid, that rather is, um, that projects its greatness by supporting all kinds of things. We can see that in the Ottoman period. We can see it in many places. You get this great state and you get these rulers who are like, hey, my state would look better if we had more madrasas and if we had some astrological observatories and things like that. And Ulugh Beg himself is a product of that, um, having been raised within that environment and intellectually curious and all of that. So he builds his observatory. And then the story in Uzbekistan is that there is a combination of political competition, among different uh, aspirants to rule who don't like Ulugh Beg, and religious ideas, so that certain um, leading religious thinkers are themselves anti-science, and then they have some military guys behind them who are like, hey, you need to put out that fatwa that says studying this stuff is all wrong and that Ulugh Beg is a kafir and things like that. And then eventually somebody murders him, and that kind of, the story is that kind of crushes science in that area for a while. And so we can find those kinds of stories throughout history that are the explanations of people from their own time saying, okay, we had all of this wonderful stuff and now this is why we don't have it. And it's usually an explanation that comes about because of a combination of political and religious thought.
Mu'tazila's thinking really influenced the Middle East, influenced the Baghdad, or maybe influenced the Abbasid, the rulers. That is, it is okay to reason
Right.
behind behind everything. When we drop something, where does it fall? Instead of thanking the God, instead of saying, well, because Allah want is to fall when you drop something. Instead of thanking everything for Allah, give Allah credit for everything. Let's do some reasoning. So that reasoning really became very popular during 800 and 900, and that's really, I guess, inspired so many people, especially rulers of Baghdad at the time, to fund uh, the research, especially the translation movement, because they did not really particularly create any new knowledge. What they did, they translate the knowledge that was created before, from that language, from Greek to maybe Arabic and Persian, and they translated them so to because they translated them, there was an appreciation for knowledge, and maybe there was some type of effort to create a new knowledge. I'm not sure whether they were
There was
able
a
to.
lot of effort to create new knowledge, obviously. I mean, they didn't just translate, they discussed, they thought, and they wrote new things and did observations and so forth. Obviously, any astronomer who was serious read every astronomical treatise that they could,
Absolutely.
all the time, and it's very clear that Ulugh Beg did that too, reading astronomical treatises that had been written for him. He read Persian and Arabic, but those were, there's an accumulation of astronomical knowledge over thousands of years, and but what he did in his observatory then was observing the movement of the stars, just as any astronomer does, and his measurements were more accurate than were others. And what I understand is that he came up with a more accurate star map and also more accurate estimations of the dimensions of the Earth. So this is a time when it's typically said that, of course, ordinary people thought that the world was flat, but astronomers didn't. And what they were trying to do is figure out, is the sun moving? Are the stars moving? Is the earth moving? What is that? And, they did have a sense of, they did know that the world was round, and they did know, and so he calculated the dimensions of the earth as well, whatever. When we look then at the history of science, of course, that his treatise, his Zij, was quickly translated into Latin, and Copernicus got his hands on it, and this is then becomes an inspiration for some of Copernicus's thinking, right? So that's and so we're talking then about what Uzbeks call a renaissance of in the 1400s, 1500s, and that actually that newly created knowledge contributes then to a flow of knowledge that is being created in Europe at the time, which retrospectively we call part of the Renaissance, right? So I think a premise that says Islamic science was only active in the Golden Age, and then after that everything gets shut down due to we can read all of those older historians who say things like, well, what happened? One, that the crushing of particular rationalist thinkers, obviously all of that makes a difference. Obviously it does. But in any part of the world, once knowledge is created, it's fairly hard to extinguish because people carry things in their heads regardless, right? And so then the question is, do they find conditions in which that knowledge can flourish or not? So the Islamic sciences don't just die. They they don't seem very active during periods when there are no conditions for them flourishing. And then when there are some conditions for them flourishing, the scholars get going again and do their thing.
Or taking us to the different direction. You were saying that, well, no, Islamic Golden Age did not die because of, maybe indirectly you pointed us, taking us that direction. Even if the Mongol invasion did not take place, it seemed like Islamic Golden Age would going to be die anyway, is because the decline of that thinking, that the rational thinking, and why
so that was the explanation you were giving. It wasn't my explanation, but it's okay. It is an explanation that a lot of Islamic Civ scholars would give. Absolutely.
Fazila's the ideologies started declining because there was another ideology took over, and that was Imam Ghazali's ideology. So Imam Ghazali was very famous or infamous, I don't know. So his ideology was like more conservative, like giving credit to the God for everything happening around us. And if you give credit to God for everything around us, then you don't need science. That was the main reason, maybe in the decline of Islamic Golden Age.
What then does your query about women have to do with any of this? Because that is, if the big question is about the history of intellectual thought in the Islamic world, is asking about women, scholars, scientists, mathematicians, just sort of a subset of that.
Right. So women kind of behind in math and science, historically in every country, including Baghdad. Even during the Golden Age, we don't see that many women really pursue their career in math and science, or any other aspect of education.
In the Golden Age, we don't see that many women pursuing a career. Period. Full stop. That's it.
That's
we don't see women in politics. We don't see women in religious leadership, for sure.
That's right.
We don't see, so
yes.
Picking out mathematics is sort of, well, yes.
It's also probably very difficult things to do at that time. And how these four women broke the barriers, and that's really interesting. Was it because of that rational thinking behind, that the parents thinking were changed, everybody thinking were changed, so that like why not? If the man can do, women also can do. Maybe not as much. I don't know. At that time, their thinking behind encouraging their daughters along the way of their sons. Probably, I think one of the thing that is cause of this women education. Number one is education starts at home. So when father or mother start teaching their children, they see who is the smart one. First, you have to believe in your children. First, you have to give them, you have to expose them to education. So once you expose them to education, you have 5 children. You give access. You give them access to education equally, all of them, all 5, all 6, all 7 of them. Doesn't really matter. And you really see, observe who is the smart one. And if you keep observing that the daughters are really smarter one, then you believe your kind of, I don't know, prejudice really started changing, because you believe what you see before your eye than what you used to believe. So then when you see your daughters are really smarter, your daughters are helping your sons more often than the other way around, then why not then, encouraging daughter to do the big thing?
Very woman you were talking about, we know only one thing about her, which is that she accomplished something. And somebody looking back historically says, well, it must be that somebody encouraged her, but we don't have the documentation to actually know that. So the point here is that it's really, really, really hard to know about the past.
That's right. It is true.
Whenever we ask questions about women in the historical past, we only get a handful of names, because those are the names that others decided to write down and to record. Now, for all we know, some of our greatest scholars of the past could have been women, but they're written down with men's names because it wasn't acceptable for them to be women scholars. Who knows?
Who knows?
Right?
Al-Khwarizmi probably got lots of help from women, but they decided.
We don't know. There's nothing written down about them, right?
They decided not to write. They decided not to give them credit. So that's why we don't know.
So we don't know.
We don't know.
Okay. So let's go to what I can help you with, maybe a tiny bit. Because, as I've laid down, I am a historian, so I know what the questions are.
Right.
But I only read secondary works about big questions about that time period, and it isn't even my area of interest, right? And so when I'm asking these kinds of questions, I'm only asking them about the 20th century.
Right.
I'm only asking them about our time. And that's what I actually know about. Something. But I don't know that much about now either, because I've never asked anything about women mathematicians.
So I'm not going to be so much specific about women mathematician. Let me ask you a general question, Professor Kamp, and that is, what are the differences between 19th centuries and 20th century and 21st century in terms of new knowledge being created by Muslim people in general and Muslim women in particular? We are studying from 19th century, 20th century, and 21st century. Before 19th century, I don't think that there was much going on.
So, having this conversation is kind of interesting to me. You have read Sayyid Ahmed Khan, and you have read...
Yeah, Sayyid...
You've read...
You're taking me South Asia again. Okay.
Al-Afghani's critique of reason and all of that. Yes?
Yes.
So we have Al-Afghani's explanation for what goes on.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And that's from within inside an Islamic culture, doing that global kind of look, saying, why is it that we Muslims have fallen behind in science? Right?
Yeah, Sayyid Ahmad Khan famously said that, and he made lots of enemies, but now he is considered as heroes in South Asia. Yeah.
Al-Afghani made an awful lot of enemies too, of course. And Al-Afghani kind of is one of the people who sets up that idea of the closing down of rationality and of the that or he's echoing other Islamic thinkers from a long time who said, when the ulama said ijtihad has been closed, then we can't really do anything. And yet, he points to the fact that Muslim scientists have existed for a long time, and obviously there's no contradiction between the ability of any individual who is Muslim to be that and also to be a scientist. And he tries to give a modern argument that we Muslims have a great history in science. We shouldn't be abandoning that. Instead, we should be embracing it now. Obviously, he's arguing against a society. He wouldn't have made those arguments if everybody was sending their kid to a modern school.
Right.
He's making the argument precisely because education globally, or at least in the West, has moved on to an entirely new stage. And he says, if we don't embrace this stage, we're screwed. Right.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that's a fairly standard position for progressive thinkers from the Islamic world of that time period. It's the same in Central Asia. In Central Asia, we find this whole new generation of young thinkers who are inspired partly by the Russian conquest, but not they're admiring of Russia. They admire Russia because they're like, wow, how'd they do that?
Right, absolutely.
Okay, well, we need to get some of that for us.
Right.
And also they are appalled, right? They're horrified, like Sayyid Ahmed Khan, like Al-Afghani. How can we have been conquered? We thought we were the greatest civilization in the world.
Right.
And now we are conquered. And so that fear, that shame, all of that also inspires new thinking and inspires an embrace of, wow, we had better get on board with science. We had better get on board with all of these other things. So that trend happens across the Middle East. It happens in Central Asia. It's everywhere. So there's this moment of crisis in the late 19th century among thinkers in the Islamic world who say, if we don't change, we have no future. Right?
Yeah.
And they use that as their way of trying to convince their own societies that we need to utterly change our approach to education more than anything else.
Okay.
And then that moves along at different rates in different places, because some governments, the Ottoman state, of course, in the mid 19th century already says, in order to deal with our current political crisis, we need to change our educational system. And they begin to adopt this idea that the state is directly the patron of education. We aren't just leaving it to communities and their kutabs. Instead, we're going to have state-sponsored schools that will teach at least these things. And they start out with teaching them to boys, and then they're like, hey, well, girls too. And the state attention to girls' education always lags behind state attention to boys' education. That's anywhere in the world. But
at the
eventually,
time, yes.
Eventually things change. They change very slowly in some places. Saudi Arabia, oh my God.
Took forever.
Took forever. It was after 1960 that they finally said, maybe girls do need some education. Whereas other places, it happened much earlier, right?
Absolutely, right. So that's why it has been a very slow progress. And when did the progress actually started?
Different places, different times. I mean, you can look at the history of different countries and say, okay, here this push toward the new happens much earlier, and here it's much later. We can look at Egypt and the rule of Muhammad Ali in 1820 to 1848 or so, I believe. And here's this crazy ruler who says, we need all kinds of new schools. We need government support for military training, but we also need government support for a school for midwives. Go figure. Yes. Why did he do that? Partly because he actually had some foreign advisors, but partly because he just saw needs, or his local advisors or whoever, somebody came up with that idea. We don't actually have great, the deep details that help us to understand where those big evolutions in thinking come about. But so in some places it's much earlier, and in some places it's much later. And in Central Asia, the big change comes about because of Soviet government and
Right.
their deep commitment to education.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. If you put them together, if you sum them up, and if you really want to kind of see only one one particular time, one particular year is really changed, it's kind of like look obvious, what year would that be?
What would you say? I can't. I'm a historian. My brain, it doesn't work that way. I can't.
So you talk about.
I cannot attribute historical things that are tremendously important in one place and say, oh, well, that's the big change, because that change doesn't change this other place.
No,
This
no.
place operates with a completely different set of conditions.
Right. What causes change in India doesn't necessarily the same reason change happen in United States, for
Yes.
example. But in India, we saw lots of change happen, as you mentioned, Syed Ahmed, and many regarded Mughals period of time 400, 300 golden age for India. But that's not true, because the Mughals were focusing on the study from Babur to Aurangzeb. They were focusing on like the building bridges, building buildings, building Taj Mahals, for example, not creating any new knowledge. So they wasted their 400, 300 years. How can we say that? Because when Mughals lost their power to British, all of a sudden, from rulers to nobody, because they did not learn any skill during 400 years. So Muslims did not realize that they were 200 years, 300 years behind Hindus. So when they lost power to British, they realized that. So Ahmed realized that we Muslim really are 200 years behind Hindus, because when they were ruling the India for 300-400 years ago, 300-400 years, Mughals, so the commerce and the business, all the things they had to do to rule the country, they rely on Hindus to do the math, and they would be doing hunting, and while the Hindus would be doing the math. And they didn't see that, they did not kind of be smart enough to see the consequence that would be when they don't have power. So once they lost the power, they really did not have any skill to get a job. So Syed Ahmed and other scholars really realized that, and they asked the society to embrace the English. That was the de facto language at that time. Maybe the science, not the science like uh, not the science without kind of any prejudice. Like I will go any direction science take us. That type of open mindset need for to being a scientist.
Mm-hmm.
So 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 that shift happened in India. Maybe I don't know how. I mean,
Right. It happened among intellectuals. Did it happen among ordinary Muslims?
I don't know.
And that's actually, I mean, I'm not a historian of India. I don't know, right? Any version you tell me is a version that I adds to my knowledge, right?
But
But
can you say it is?
but how do we know? To me, what really allows science to flourish is what not when a handful of wealthy and important people who come from intellectual lineages are able to support science, but when scientific knowledge becomes um, shared through public schools, and the possibility for any ordinary person to become a thinker is there,
I think
right?
I think it is just at home. I think it's just at home with parents. So parents should have open mind. Parents should be willing to kind of say to their
Well, sure,
children.
but you are presupposing the existence of public education there, because parents can think anything they want to, but if they live in a society where 90% of the people are illiterate and don't send their children to school at all, say that, if that's not one of their options, then
That's
they
not one
can't
of their
foster.
option. Absolutely.
And so
Yeah.
I think when you're thinking about things like this, I mean, there's the intellectual side of it and there's the psychological side of it, but there's the social side of
And
it.
there is a
And the social
reality.
side of it is,
Yeah.
when does public education become a widespread mass reality? And this is differential for boys and girls. And that's one of the fundamental things that you would have to ask about. Why is it that in the 20th century, when countries begin to commit to the idea of mass public education, they support that more for boys than they do for girls? Is that the case, really? And this is really a very specific Islamic world question.
Right. Right.
Because when we look at the rate of school attendance for girls versus boys in Pakistan, for example, it has always been way behind. So boys are going to school at twice the rate girls are.
Right.
Now it's gotten better, but we can see the same thing repeated in Afghanistan, which is horrible now, of course.
Malala, for example, Malala is not that popular in Pakistan, by the way.
Yeah, because at a social level, there are many people who would say we don't need girls like that.
Yes,
right.
That's right. Yes.
And so I understand what you're saying about it starts at the home, but you're saying it starts with parents who are open-minded enough to send their children to school, their daughters,
right,
and to promote their daughters' education through the higher ranks. You're right about that, but it also supposes that there is a structure into which those girls can enter. And that structure into which those girls can enter only exists if the society, the government, whatever, is sufficiently supportive of public education to make that a reality so that families actually do have that choice at all. So if we want to go to things that I know better, present day Uzbekistan, right? Soviet period, the Soviet government was very deeply dedicated to the idea of mass public education. The investments that they made in opening schools in the 20s and 30s and in creating massive numbers of teachers, not well-trained teachers, but just teachers who could teach literacy, they are phenomenal. The shift in literacy rates in the 1920s and 1930s in Central Asia is mind-blowing. So you go from the rates that we can estimate for the indigenous people, Muslims and others, in Uzbekistan in 1924, it's something like 10 to 15% of men and boys are literate. That is, 85 to 90% of them are not literate. Among women, the estimations, in cities, maybe 10% were literate. In the countryside, maybe 1%. You go to the 1930s. By the end of the 1930s, if you're looking at the younger generation, the ones who would have been enrolled in school in the 1920s and 1930s, suddenly we're leaping to rates of 70, 80% literacy. This is phenomenal. This is incredible. This only happens because a government is deeply dedicated to providing mass public education. Why are they doing that? Because they think everyone can become a scientist? No. Because they think that it's necessary for, the new order, and in order to become a modern country and blah, blah, blah. You never know what will happen with all of this education. But they also created lots and lots of higher education institutions and institutions where people could go and become scientists. And there was direct government propaganda on a regular basis all the time about the importance of educating daughters, the importance of sending girls to school, that we want girls to go to higher education. And so by the 1960s, the presence of women in higher education in Central Asia, even among indigenous people, is significant. It's not huge. There are always far more men than women
Right.
entering higher education
Right.
from the indigenous population. But nonetheless, there are women who become scientists and scholars and professors and all of this.
Right.
And the state notices them, celebrates them, makes a big deal about them, tries to present that as a good thing, a wonderful thing. You want this for your daughter. And the state did that in the face of an awful lot of social opposition.
I see. So the changes really actually happened from 1919 in Russia.
Russia is one thing. Central Asia is a totally different thing.
But it's they use Russia as a source of inspiration, right?
Uh, the Soviet state, of course, starts with revolution in February of 1917. The actual impact of big changes starts in 1924 in Central Asia with the delimitation of the Central Asian republics. And it is not inspiration, it's control. So Moscow controls those places
I
and
see.
says, you will do this and you will implement that. So in that sense, Russia is important,
Right, absolutely.
as the controller of all of this.
Absolutely, because it was Soviet Union at that time. And
Yes.
and who do you give credit? Do you give credit to Bolshevik? Do you give credit to someone for these changes?
Every success has 1,000 fathers, right?
Oh, is it your quote?
That's a quote.
That's a quote, yeah.
Yes, it's a saying. Success has 1,000 fathers. So of course, in the Soviet times, everyone would have said, "This is because of Lenin."
This is because of Lenin. He lived only 2 years. I think he served Soviet Union only 2 years, right?
No, he died in 1924. So
okay,
he was
few years.
leader,
Okay,
7 years,
7
6
years,
years,
6-7
really.
years, yeah.
But in Central Asia, of course, I as a social historian would say, obviously, it's not just because of Russia. It's also because of an awful lot of intellectuals in Central Asia who said these are things that are good. They're the Sayyid Ahmad Khans of their own generation who say what we need to do here is have our schools in our language. This was not education in Russian. This was education in indigenous languages. That's what made it popular. And they could not possibly have done education in Russian in the 1920s and 1930s. There weren't enough Russian speakers around. So popularizing education was a local project too. It wasn't just that Moscow wants us to do it. It was that there were plenty of people in Central Asia who said, this is what we need. But the Soviet Union did promote science for women, definitely. In Central Asia, though, what tended to happen, so there's a large generation of women scholars and intellectuals, especially starting in the 1960s, from the indigenous population, Uzbeks and Tajiks and Kazakhs and others. And from things that I read, again, this is not my subject of study. I have been on committees where students have done this kind of research. They faced a lot of struggles with their careers, and their careers were not as supported as men's were. In what way? Basically, everyone in Central Asia would say this, but there's a good recent book that kind of documents it by Zareen Amman. She says, in Central Asia, in the Muslim families, which is everybody, right? That's the indigenous population. There continue to be attitudes that a woman needs to, families should raise their daughters to become good wives and mothers. That is their first duty. It's their most important one. And then if they get an education, that's lovely. It will help to create better educated children. Yay.
Yeah, that was the main purpose, right?
But do they need this education?
No.
Should we prioritize girls' education the same way we do boys? most families would say no.
Now,
And
most
this is in conditions where they have access, where during the Soviet period, it wouldn't have been so much of an economic hardship to send their daughters for higher education, but they still would prioritize boys over girls. And after a woman completed her degree and maybe she wants to go on to a doctorate, she's going to have to fight family pressures against that.
that's right.
So it's a constant battle for women to break the social norm
That's right.
and to try to pursue that kind of and so in that sense, yeah, they have to come from either very open-minded families that really genuinely do value their daughters in the same way they do their sons, or value their wives in the same way as husbands,
Right, right.
or they have to break out of that somehow.
Right, that's still happening in South Asia, right? The women really, a particular woman really doesn't start her fight against her husband. No, the fight really starts very earlier when she was probably 5 or 6 year old against their parent. The fight for her right, that I have equal right for education there, just like my other siblings. So yeah, the fight really starts at home against their parents. Maybe parents also love them as much as they love their sons, but the prejudice, the stereotype, the parents also suffer from stereotypes.
So one could look at it that way. They suffer from stereotypes. I think that a lot of the people that I know in Central Asia would say that a good life is one where you live like other people rather than where you cut out your own path and you pursue your own thing. And so parents loving their daughters strongly believe that they're doing what is best for them if they shape and form them so that they can conform to a society where women's first need, right, duty, joy, as they would put it, is to be a wife and mother.
Right.
And so they would not see this as prejudicial. They would see it
That's
as
right. As
supportive.
normal, as supportive. That's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
And
Yeah. They don't.
and so that too goes to a whole societal set of ideas that
That's
we can
right.
call stereotypes,
That's right.
but that are actually very rational calculations, right? Do I want to raise my child in such a way that she is going to have to fight her whole life?
Right. Right.
Or do I want to raise her in a way that allows her to conform and we hope be happy because we believe that this is what makes most women happy?
Right. So yeah, they don't know. They don't even realize that they are suffering from stereotypes. If you don't know you have disease, how are you going to take the treatment? Yeah, that's, I don't know how long that's, I mean, when there would be an end to that. Maybe, I don't know. If there is no end to that, then there would always be, the women are always going to be behind and some part of the world.
Let me add a little bit to that. One of the interesting things that has happened in Central Asia is, and this is not just Uzbekistan, this is the other countries of Central Asia as well. During the Soviet Union created this big structure for higher education, but then they invested heavily in higher education in the 1960s, and they expanded the system a lot. And then in the 70s and 80s, they were not really expanding that higher education system. Meanwhile, the population in Central Asia in particular was growing very fast. And so the number of seats available in higher educational institutions became proportionally smaller vis-a-vis the numbers of teenagers coming up to the possibility of entering. And so you have a limited number of seats and a growing number of potential people who can go into those seats. And at that point, we start to see the proportions in Uzbekistan and Tajikistan and Turkmenistan. We see the proportion of girls going down.
I see.
Because at this point, so it's not that parents wouldn't have wanted their daughters to go at all,
Right.
but in these conditions of scarcity, where this takes bribes and it takes pushing and it takes this and that, they're going to invest in the son, not the daughter, right? In post Soviet, Central Asia, countries have, um, Kazakhstan was the first to do this. They invested heavily in opening new universities. And so they made higher education much more available. And voila, 60% of all enrollees in higher education are girls.
Right now
Yeah.
in
The same
Kazakhstan.
is
That's
true in
amazing.
Kyrgyzstan, though for some different reasons. In Uzbekistan, that investment in expanding higher education institutions has really happened in the past 7 years under the leadership of President Mirziyoyev, who decided this is the way to go. We are going to, and he opens the doors, says, come on in, establish new universities. The number of seats in universities has gone up massively. The proportional enrollment of girls in higher education has also gone up massively. It was about 30%. It's in the 40s now. So it's when it becomes more affordable, less a matter of battling to get your child in,
Right.
less a matter of having to pay bribes,
Right.
but genuinely available. That changes everything for
That changes
girls.
everything. Now the parents are not under pressure to choose
Yes.
whether boy or
Yes.
girl who should go to school.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so so this is why I went earlier when we were talking about this. I said that all assumes the availability of public
So
education.
the message here is maybe we can end our conversation with this message. Your message is here is what is happening in Central Asia. Make it available around the world. Make more schools, colleges, and university for everybody, and then the parents would be less under pressure, and that benefit the girls.
Mm-hmm. And that means then it doesn't have to be a total change in individual understanding of. Instead, because it is available, it becomes normal to think that, of course, my daughters can go to higher education just as my sons can.